You know, there's a geological word that I like to use, which is palimpsest, with layers of different eras. And whenever you hit an urban landscape, you nearly always see the product of various eras of development layered on top of each other. What we're standing on here, of course, is the High Line, which delivered goods to all sorts of small factories and manufacturing and industries and warehousing and all the rest of it. Fell into disrepair rather badly in the 1970s and 1980s, and then comes the big question of how is this going to be redeveloped, and the big fight then ensues as to who's going to get the rights to it, what they're going to build there. And so what you see now is the outcome of a struggle. I'm David Harvey, and I'm here in the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, right at catty corner from the Empire State Building, teaching Marx's Capital in the shadow of the iconic imperial building of international capitalism. I moved to the United States in 1969, and I went to Baltimore, and I got there the year after there had been uprisings in all of the cities of the United States after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So I moved to a city where quite a significant chunk of it had burned down, then became involved immediately in the kind of questions as to what went on that led to that eruption, but then also proactively how would I organize myself and other people to change it. There was a lot of what was called at the time blockbusting going on in the city, which was the introduction of an African-American family into a white neighborhood, and then the deliberate push by real estate interests to generate white flight. One of the questions which was coming up all the time was who profits from the segregation, who profits from this turnover in the housing market, and that of course gets me back to the kind of questions I nearly always end up asking these days, like, okay, show me the money, where the money's flowing, who's getting, you know, a real benefit out of it. This is like a scene from The Fountainhead. This is Ayn Rand country. I think the idea of the Hudson Yards all along was to be the western extension of Midtown. But what in effect has happened is that this has now been seized upon, and so you've got this pole of development here, and there's a gap now between this and the Midtown. So I guess this is the sort of thing that Neil Smith used to talk about the rent gap. And that almost certainly there's a huge pressure now for redevelopment, and you already see some of the buildings being refurbished and redone. Some may end up being knocked down and high-rises put in. The original population from the 1980s has completely disappeared from here. The city is a concentrated space in which many different functions can coexist and can work together in such a way as to facilitate social reproduction. Unfortunately, that social reproduction has to include, in our case, the reproduction of capital as well as the reproduction of people. And so what we see is a concentration of resources to build a city which is going to facilitate capital accumulation and is therefore functioning for capital accumulation. One of the things that is crucial to understand about capital is that it has to expand in order to survive. Historically, the rate of growth has always been positive in a healthy capitalist economy, and usually people look to 3 or 4% rate of growth as being, adequate. But zero growth is a crisis. So you've got to grow. Now, where do you grow and where do you grow into? Okay, I'm investing in a city and I build up and the city's built up. Now, what do I do? Well, okay, if the city's built up, I've got to sort of expand it somehow, but I then build the suburbs. Then, how do we get to the suburb and back again? You've got to have the new transport and communications structures. So there's a spatial growth aspect to this, which is always there. This process is about capital, which is expanding at a compound rate of 3% forever, having harder and harder time finding sensible and serious things to do in a world which obviously needs a great deal in terms of facilities and services and the rest of it. We've got a politics of austerity which cuts back on all of the things that we really need, and at the same time goes off and builds these crazy monuments to I don't know what in Dubai and here in New York with all the condos and all the rest of it going up. So this was what I call a spatial fix, which is about the fact that you have to grow at a compound rate. And I think we're facing that as one of the big contradictions of contemporary capitalist life. It's very interesting reading the IMF reports over the last 20 or 30 years. Again and again they come back and say there's a surplus of liquidity. The world is awash with surplus liquidity, looking for some place to go, looking for something to do. And so this is what you do. and then you hope it works. But in order for it to work, you probably need another round of this somewhere else in order to make this. The small version of this, when I was looking at Baltimore, we used to call it feeding the downtown monster. That the first bunch of investment downtown was not paying off. But in order to make it pay off, you built another ring, and then the first round did start to pay off because but then the second one wasn't paying off, so you needed a third. The result was that all the public monies in Baltimore went less and less to schools and neighborhoods and all this kind of stuff. It was going to feeding the downtown monster. I mean, I grew up in a sort of respectable working class neighborhood in Britain, where the way in which housing was thought of was essentially in what Marx would call use value terms. I mean, you wanted a place to live, and you got a decent place to live, and it was very important. About 20 years later, suddenly you find people are really less and less thinking about the use value. They're more and more thinking about the exchange value. And then there comes a point, in the 1990s it started to become much more like this, where actually housing became an instrument of speculative gain, where people, instead of just thinking about the exchange value, started to think about the house as a form of capital accumulation by getting a house, fixing it up, flipping it, and going on to somewhere else, so on. So you go through a kind of a very interesting history in my own lifetime of a housing from a use value to an exchange value to a form of capital accumulation through speculation. But you'll find right now in a city like New York that it's being built in terms of the housing construction and all the rest of it is for people to invest in, not for people to live in. And the result is you've got starvation at one end of the housing scale and you've got oversupply at the other end of the housing scale. I think the idea of a socialist future would be to say that we could come on this spot in 30 years' time when the world has become totally socialist, and we would look at all of this and say, oh, well, I don't know, that was all done in that crazy period where financiers kind of ruled the world, and now they've all been sort of overcome, and these are now kind of monuments, if you like, to stupidity. of a certain era in which the ultra-rich were so rich that they didn't know what to do with their money except to build things like this. I have to say that since I moved to New York, I've thought more and more, as many people I know think about New York as a city. And they think about it as a political entity. And that civic sense is what I would say forms the heart of a body politic. And a body politic doesn't pre-exist. It has to be created and it has to be nurtured and the like. So there's something relational about being in this space which is New York, which makes it New York. I think the city stands for something other than simply a physical artifact. It is a political concept, and there's something that connects the idea of city with citizenship and belonging to something which is different from, you know, just a local neighborhood. And it means something politically.